Superhero fatigue. That's a phrase a lot of people have been dragging out over the years, and even to this day. Ever since films like Avengers Endgame represented the high point of comic book cinema, the idea that has been the point of watching these big budget superhero films have diminished. Because what more can be said, and what more can be done? And since then, the reception and financial success of many projects from any studio, whether it's Marvel or not and DC, has been more mixed. It's no longer the success after so many stumbles in this era. Yet today, something remarkable has shown up that said otherwise, and it's coming from Spider-Man. As of this recording, Spider-Man Brand New Day has opened to over $350 million domestic and $927 million worldwide in a single weekend. These are numbers we literally haven't seen since Endgame, numbers that are close to outright beating it. And that is the most insane part, because Brand New Day is a more contained Spider-Man story. This film just focuses mostly on Peter, and it's not one that focuses on nostalgic versions of himself coming together in a multiverse, and its only involvement from other MCU stars are like the Punisher and the Hulk. An opening like this actually puts a hole in the narrative of superhero fatigue as we've known it online, the way people have been talking about it, and the idea of how one movie can fall off. Because how can this idea still hold if a movie of this caliber is able to perform like an event film? The kind of numbers only a multi-team-up movie has been used to do so. That's why I really want to explain it today, because the notion of fatigue is actually more selective than we might think. It doesn't fully capture the truth of how people actually enjoy films. Because when we hear the discourse, it often gets an ideological flavor. This is why Marvel is flaying, or this is why DC sucks. I've done that in some cases when talking about how certain characters are written, but that's not the broader picture. A film by itself, despite its connections, doesn't determine the entire path going forward. And even if the saga is branded under a select group of films like Infinity or Multiverse, and with the MCU characters and the world itself, there has to be a lot said otherwise, because people still want it. Now, to understand why fatigue conversation got so loud after Endgame, we have to look at the Infinity Saga and what it did. That whole run from Iron Man to Endgame wasn't a string of perfect equal successes. Not every film was a major hit, where some did well and some did fine and a few underperformed. But they all tracked towards the same destination. Every movie, even the smaller ones, felt like it led to something bigger. And so that consistency created the one long narrative piece. Characters you met in 2008 were still paying off in 2019. Relationships that started in mid-tier films still mattered in the biggest movies of all time. So when Infinity War and especially Endgame arrived, a lot of people felt like they had to show up. It just wasn't another superhero movie, it was the celebration, the finale. The things that previous 11 years had been building towards. And once that celebration was over, a lot of people did walk away feeling satisfied like myself. Like, okay, that was the story, we got the ending, and there's no real need to see what happens next because we got our enjoyment, and take it casually. So when the Multiverse Saga started, the attitude for a lot of the general audiences shifted. It was no longer feeling like every movie was a required chapter in one giant ongoing novel. It felt more casual, at least to us, something you could take and leave depending on that specific story or character that interested you. Even though again, on the other attitude of the multiverse was stories that tried to connect but failed the same way the Infinity Saga did, in an overcomplicated mess. And that's a huge change in how people approach these films. The Infinity Saga trained audiences to invest in the long game, where Endgame paid off that investment so completely that the level of the automatic commitment just wasn't there anymore. The movie still existed in the same universe, but the urgency, the feeling that I need to see this or I'll miss the bigger part, had mostly gone away. And that's where the real shift made selectivity more visible. Again, it was there present from the start, but the overall attitude just came with the Multiverse Saga, which did not get the cleanest start. Coming right after COVID, the whole theatrical landscape just was unstable. Black Widow became the first real symbol of that mess, in a movie that been delayed multiple times and then released on Disney Plus and ended up in this weird hybrid situation that left a lot of people unsure how to feel about supporting this movie in theaters. It set a tone of uncertainty right from the jump. Shang-Chi was also a good film, where a lot of people who liked it saw it, but box office wise it still underperformed relative to a strong, fresh Marvel movie that should have done better in a healthier market. That gap between quality and financial success became more noticeable. And then you had films like Eternals, big, ambitious, and for a lot of the general audience, just generally confusing. These movies just started to feel less clear, character-driven stories and more like elaborate set pieces that assumed you were already deeply plugged into the larger universe. That accessibility that the Infinity Saga had built up just started slipping. But even in the middle of all that, there were clear signs that people hadn't checked out completely. On the other hand, you had Spider-Man Far From Home right after Endgame showing that they were willing to show up for the character and the right tone. And then No Way Home came out a few years later and completely blew the doors off, proving that demand was still massive. The one in the Multiverse Saga nonetheless. Even Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness at the start had real interest going into it. People wanted to see it. It had that explosive opening where the idea of the multiverse, the return of certain characters, and the chaos generated real curiosity, but the way it handled its characters and its story ended up dragging it down for a lot of the viewers. The interest at the start was there, but the execution fully didn't stick the landing for everyone. So early on, the Multiverse Saga wasn't suffering from a total lack of audience, it was suffering from inconsistency. Some films felt confusing or compromised, mixed in with others that still proved that people would show up when something actually mattered or connected. Another big part of the Multiverse Saga that changed the dynamic was the multi-brand approach, especially those Disney Plus shows that launched right at the beginning. Suddenly, if you wanted to fully understand what happened on the big screen, you were expected to have kept up with hours of television. That raised the barrier for casual viewers in the way that the Infinity Saga never did, and it created that split. Some projects lived on in the massive theatrical scale, while others felt like mid-tier or streaming tier stories that just happened to get a movie release. Not every audience member was equally attracted to both. Depending on the project, people simply checked out or checked in. That's what you saw clearly with something like Captain America Brave New World, a new Captain America that should have been a big deal, but the appeal just wasn't there for a wider audience the way that Marvel hoped, and it didn't connect on the level that people expected from that title. And again, on the other case like the Marvels, after the success of Captain Marvel before Endgame, that represented a big drop-off, which included too many characters and too much comedy that people wouldn't care about the same thing. Even films that were actually good ran into that same issue. Thunderbolts got critical responses, the Fantastic Four also was well liked by a lot of people who saw it, but neither reached the box office heights that the positive reviews might have suggested in the same way that the older MCU films suggested. And that's not because audiences hated them, it's because those specific stories and characters just didn't pull in that broader, more casual crowd. And this is where selectivity becomes more obvious again. Look at Spider-Man No Way Home at the end of 2021. The world was still finishing its recovery from COVID and theaters were not fully back to normal. And yet, that movie became a cultural event and one of the biggest films of all time. It didn't need massive homework and didn't need mandatory continuity. Sure, it's a film produced mostly by Sony, but it's also in the MCU produced by Marvel Studios under Disney brand. It just had a story and a character that had a huge number of people who were genuinely interested in seeing. And that's the difference. When the appeal is wide enough, people show up in massive numbers, even in a complicated era. Compared to when the appeal is narrow in a set of a film, even a well-made one can only go so far. The Multiverse Saga just didn't kill interest in Marvel, it just made it more clearer that the interest was always been selective. It tells you that a baseline of interest never really disappeared. People have been showing up for these films. The mid-tier numbers in the Multiverse era are still pulling numbers that in an earlier time would have been considered solid successes for some of the films. They're just no longer being judged against the impossible standard that Endgame and other billion-dollar outliers set. And it doesn't have to be, and it shouldn't be. So when you remove the giant event films from the equation, the story stops looking like a total audience rejection and looks more like what people been saying. All people still show up, and they're just more selective about what they want to watch, with less automatic loyalty every single release. And that demand is still there, it's just not evenly distributed anymore. And in this logic, this is actually more healthier for the studios and budget. It forces people to rethink what can be done. So why do people actually still want this? Because when you set the tone, the character, and the stakes line up with a wider audience that actually responds to it, the interest actually comes back fast. Look at Avengers Doomsday for example. Even after the original plans changed, going from a King-centered story to a Doctor Doom-centered story with Robert Downey Jr. and the mess of what they actually built up, the tracking still has been extremely strong. The trailers are still generating real excitement, and early advance sales are already impressive. People do want to see it, not because they're loyal to every MCU release, but because they're presented with a higher stakes, broader Avengers movie that people have been missing. That same idea is why Spider-Man Brand New Day is performing the way it is. It's a more grounded take on Peter Parker again, focusing on his struggles after everything that happened to him. It's not leaning on the multiversal nostalgia or forced crossovers, it's just Spider-Man learning to live with the weight of his choices. And that core is always what's made his character connect with so many people. And compare that with many films that didn't land so hard. None as relatable as someone like Spider-Man through the years, because of who he is. Not every movie, on the other hand, is Thor Love and Thunder, where the character was pushed into a more comedic, almost silly space, where in Doomsday, Thor looks more like a serious player again. People didn't reject Thor, a lot of them just didn't connect with a particular version of the character. The same thing with Marvels. The idea of the team up, the tone, and the general comedic vibe just didn't appeal to a wider audience the way that Captain Marvel managed to at the time. One felt like it had a clearer identity and stronger pull, the other felt lighter and less essential to a lot of people based on the homework of previous series that the other characters were involved in. That difference in appeal mattered more than the shared universe that they both lived in. So when Brand New Day goes back to a more grounded personal Spider-Man story, and Doomsday looks like it's aiming for a darker, high-stakes Avengers film, audience do respond. They're not tired of the characters. They're tired of versions that don't feel like they match the way they want for those exact characters. That's why the demand is there. And this bigger point lands when you look outside of Marvel for a second. Look what's happened over at DC. The new DCU has not had the cleanest of starts. A big part of that goes back to how the previous DCU kept sabotaging itself for years. Inconsistent tones, rushed team-ups, constant course corrections, in a general sense that the studio never fully trusted its own plan. And that left a lot of damage. So when the new universe launched, it was already carrying extra weight. People were cautious, the goodwill wasn't automatically there before because you had the history that was there, so people wouldn't actually be interested in you rebooting the same thing over again. But the way the stories have been presented so far felt too small for a lot of people, especially international audiences. The scale of these heroes don't automatically translate into emotional investment if the world around them and the way the story is sold does not give the audience a strong enough reason to show up. Where more specifically, when we talk about international audiences, that is a totally different ballgame in the way that we respond here domestically with our own arguments about culture wars or others. A person in China doesn't carry the same values in a person in America. Every country is different in the way that they approach things. So it doesn't matter if a story has a carefully plotted path or a long-term universe plan. It doesn't matter if the powerful characters on paper or how many connections exist between films. What matters more is how do you sell it, the tone, the emotional core, the specific appeal of the movie right now. Marvel's Multiverse Saga has had plenty of problems, but when a film like Brand New Day or the upcoming Doomsday lines up with a broad audience actually wants from those characters, people still come. And at the end of the day, audiences don't own brands their attention. They respond to an individual movie in front of them. Superhero fatigue was never really about the genre being dead. It was more about how often the movies stopped giving people a clear, compelling reason to care. And when they do actually give reason for people to care, just like Brand New Day did, the audience is still more willing to show up. So the real truth about superhero fatigue is, just because the shared universe isn't delivering success after success the way it used to, doesn't mean the entire genre is broken. It just means automatic loyalty is gone. People are just doing what they've always done, picking and choosing what actually interests them. They showed up for No Way Home, they're showing up for Brand New Day, and they're showing up for more than that, suggesting they'll show it again when the next big one will feel worth it. The audience never fully left. They just stopped choosing what they were being told to choose. And that selectivity, not some permanent exhaustion with the genre, is what we've been looking at the whole time. I'm all done. Goodbye.